Imagine a calm night in ancient Greece. The sky is clear, dotted with thousands of silent stars. The wind glides across the mountains of the Peloponnese, whispering through the leaves of the cypress trees. Down below, in the valley between the rivers Eurotas and Taygetos, lies a city unlike any other, Sparta. But lies might be the wrong word to describe Sparta, because there, even in the deepest darkness, men do not sleep like others. They sleep with a spear resting against their chest. They sleep with half-shut eyes, alert to every sound. They sleep ready to fight. Sparta was not a city like Athens, full of markets, theaters, or philosophical debates. Sparta was, above all, an idea of absolute discipline, of war as virtue, of personal renunciation for the sake of the collective. From birth, a Spartan belonged to the state. When a baby was born, it was taken before the city elders, who would decide whether it was strong enough to live. The weak were discarded, abandoned on the slopes of Mount Taygetos, in a cruel ritual meant to shield Sparta's future glory from weakness. It was the first lesson. Life was a privilege reserved for the strong. At the age of 7, boys were taken from their families and sent to the Uxagogs, the most rigorous military education system ever conceived in antiquity. There they would learn to endure pain, hunger, and cold. They would sleep on the ground without blankets. They would be punished if caught stealing, but also punished if they didn't steal, because part of the lesson was learning to survive through cunning, courage, and silence. A boy who screamed during a beating showed weakness. One who endured in silence, even while bleeding, became an example. One story tells of a boy who stole a fox cub to eat. When questioned by a soldier, he refused to reveal what he hid under his tunic, enduring in silence until the animal devoured his entrails. He did not scream. He died standing. This brutal education produced men who no longer belonged to themselves. They belonged to Sparta. At 20, they became part of the regular army, living in communal barracks, eating together, training together. Marriage was allowed, but until the age of 30, a man did not sleep with his wife every night. Duty was always stronger than desire. Among them, silence was the rule. A Spartan spoke little, but when he did, his words were sharp. That is why the term laconic was born, from Laconia, the region where Sparta was located. To be laconic was to be direct, efficient, essential. But even in a city of soldiers, there were rituals, beliefs, and hidden tenderness beneath the armor. Spartan women, for example, were respected in ways that shocked other Greeks. They were free, could inherit land, manage businesses, and trained their bodies to bear strong children. They were told, "Your child is yours only until he is born. Then he belongs to the polis, and to the widows of war no sorrow was offered, only honor. Blessed is the mother whose son died standing." When husbands left for war, women handed them their shields, saying, "Return with it, or on it." For a Spartan, abandoning the shield on or the fight was the ultimate shame. Night continues in Sparta. The fires go out. The cold earth holds the bodies of boys in training. But their sleep is light. Tomorrow brings more drills, more simulated combat, more trials of endurance. Because one day the enemy will come, and when he comes, Sparta must be ready. That's why even now, under the pale light of the moon, an old warrior keeps watch atop the Acropolis, his spear resting on stone, eyes alert, hands steady. He does not doze off. He cannot doze off. In Sparta, men sleep like beasts on guard, because peace is always fleeting. And what Sparta does not yet know is that, in just a few years, an army will rise in the east, so vast it will shake the ground of Greece. A king crowned in gold, carried by living thrones, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of warriors. And among all the cities it will be Sparta, with only 300, that will stand before the Persian fury. But that story has yet to arrive. Now close your eyes, let the Spartan night wrap around you. Breathe slowly, like the boys of the Agog. Hear the wind between the spears, the faint crackle of torches, and fall asleep to the whisper of a city made of stone, steel, and silence. While Sparta forged warriors with iron and discipline far away, the land stretched endlessly under the golden glow of an eastern sun. This was the Persian Empire, a civilization so vast that time itself seemed to bend before it. Upon waking in the palace of Persepolis, a man could send out messengers, and still wait weeks for answers from his most distant provinces. It was an empire where languages varied, landscapes changed, but power remained as steady as a cloudless sky. There ruled the King of Kings. It all began with Cyrus the Great, the man who dreamed of uniting all peoples under one banner. He did not conquer only with swords, but with wisdom. He freed the Jews from Babylon, respected the local gods of every conquered land, and founded an empire based on religious tolerance, administrative organization, and a justice system that even impressed the Greeks. Cyrus built bridges of stone and of culture. His laws were so admired that Alexander, centuries later, would weep before his tomb. After Cyrus came Darius the true architect of the classical Persian Empire, a man who understood war, but also numbers, roads, and taxes. He divided the empire into satrapies, autonomous regions ruled by loyal governors. He created the daric, a gold coin accepted in all provinces. He built the Royal Road, a route over 2,000 kilometers long that connected Susa to Lydia. Messengers rode day and night, changing horses at regular stations, delivering imperial orders faster than any other empire could dream of. Neither snow nor rain nor heat, nor the darkness of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, a phrase that, millennia later, would even inspire modern postal services. But Darius also knew ambition, and it was ambition that led him to Greece. When the Ionian cities rebelled with the support of Athens, he vowed revenge. In 490 before Christ, he marched on Greece, only to be defeated at the famous Battle of Marathon. Humiliated, he died before fulfilling his conquest. His son, Xerxes I, would inherit not only the throne, but the promise of vengeance. Xerxes was not merely a king, he was, in the Persian view, a god among men. Tall, imposing, with a long, well-groomed beard, clad in tunics embroidered with golden thread, and a crown that gleamed like the sun itself. Unlike the Greek kings who mingled with their people, Xerxes was untouchable. He lived surrounded by eunuchs, advisors, priests, and an elite guard known as the Immortals, 10,000 warriors who never showed weakness. When one fell, another immediately took his place, maintaining the illusion of invincibility. When he resolved to avenge his father, Xerxes didn't just want to defeat Greece, he wanted to crush it. And so began the planning of the largest military campaign of antiquity. He ordered the construction of a floating bridge across the Hellespont, linking Asia to Europe. When the first bridge was destroyed by a storm, he commanded that the sea be whipped with chains, as if it were a disobedient servant. Then, he rebuilt it with even more force. Over 700 ships were lashed side by side, covered with wooden planks, forming a solid path for his entire army, cavalry, archers, war chariots, and slaves, to cross. It is estimated that over 2 million people took part in that colossal march. Though exact numbers are debated, there is no doubt it was one of the largest military movements in history. Along the way, the Persians devastated forests, consumed resources, and left marks of their passing. Smaller kingdoms bowed at the sight of Persian banners on the horizon. Xerxes was a force of nature, and his eyes were set on Greece. But there was something the King of Kings did not expect: the resistance of small, proud cities used to fighting among themselves, but who, faced with a common enemy, would unite their spears, shields, and courage. Xerxes did not yet know, but Greek resistance would not be just military. It would be symbolic, and at the heart of that resistance would not be Athens, but Sparta, that same silent city built on steel and honor, that slept with one eye open. Soon the paths of the Persians and the Spartans would cross in the narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, and there 300 men would make history against millions. But that march is still underway. For now, imagine the sound of wheels rolling over earth, the distant murmur of horses, and the voices of generals shouting commands in ancient Persian. The ground of Greece begins to tremble, but you can sleep in peace for now. Before the armies marched and the spears clinked beneath the eastern sun, there were words, and before the words there was fear and pride, and a small spark, almost invisible, lit not in mighty Sparta, nor in the golden halls of Persepolis, but among the humble ports of Greek cities under Persian rule, along the shores of the Aegean Sea. It is there, in silence, that the story begins, a story that would lead thousands to their deaths, and raise 300 men to the pantheon of eternity. Let us return to the end of the 6th century before Christ. Asia Minor, the region we now call Turkey, was under Persian control. Cities like Ephesus, Miletus, Halicarnassus, and many others lived under the rule of Persian satraps. Though they maintained some local freedom, their most important decisions were in the hands of tyrants imposed by Darius I. Many of these rulers were complicit, ambitious, and served the empire more than the people. Tension was rising. In Miletus, a figure emerged, Aristagoras, a clever and vain tyrant seeking to expand his power. After a failed attempt to conquer the island of Naxos with Persian support, his position weakened. Fearing removal, Aristagoras did the unthinkable. He incited the Ionian Greek cities to rebel against the Persian Empire. It was the year 499 before Christ, and that small, local revolt would become the spark of a global war. The Ionian cities burned their symbols of submission, overthrew the tyrants, and rose in the name of freedom. It was a Greek cry, but a muffled one. Alone, they knew they could not long withstand the Persian colossus, so they sought help. They crossed the sea and sent emissaries to plead with their Hellenic brothers on the other side. Sparta refused. Sparta always mistrusted causes that were not its own. But Athens listened and answered. With 20 ships, the Athenians landed on the Ionian coast and set fire to Sardis, one of the regional capitals of the Persian Empire. It was a bold, symbolic, and devastating act. The flames lit the skies and roads. Temples and palaces were consumed by fire. Darius I in his court heard of the attack and, it is said, made a vow. He took up his bow and shot an arrow into the sky, praying to the gods to let him live until he had destroyed Athens. And every night thereafter, he ordered a servant to whisper in his ear, "Master, remember the Athenians." The Ionian revolt was brutally crushed in the years that followed. Cities were retaken, looted, and punished. Aristagoras fled. Miletus was razed. But the gesture remained. Athens had interfered in the affairs of the greatest empire on earth, and for that it was marked. Darius began to weave his revenge as one would weave a Persian carpet, thread by thread, with infinite patience. In 492 before Christ, the king sent his first expedition to punish the Greeks, but a storm destroyed his fleet as it tried to round Mount Athos. 2 years later, a new campaign was launched. This time, the Persians reached the plain of Marathon, just a few kilometers from Athens. The Athenians, though outnumbered, faced the invaders with courage, strategy, and speed. The battle lasted only a few hours. The Persians were defeated, and the world realized that the empire could bleed. That was where the legend of the marathon runner was born. A soldier named Phidippides is said to have run from Sparta to Athens and then to Marathon itself to seek help and announce victory. He is believed to have covered over 200 kilometers in just a few days. When he arrived, he collapsed and died from exhaustion. His sacrifice became a symbol of resistance. Today, thousands run marathons in his honor, though most do not know exactly what they're honoring. For Darius, the defeat at Marathon was not the end. It was merely a delay. He began preparing a new offensive, but death reached him before the plan was realized. His son, Xerxes, would inherit the throne, the fury, and the mission, and so destiny was sealed. The greatest empire on earth was ready to crush the small and proud Greeks, and among those Greeks, few seemed afraid of what was coming. Athens sharpened its ships. Sparta sharpened its silence. And soon, in the narrow paths between sea and mountain, where the wind howls between the stones and the heat of the earth rises like vapor from the gods, 300 men would stand as a wall against millions. But for now, the war still sleeps, and you may sleep too. Feel the echo of sandals on stone, the whisper of sails out at sea, the clinking of words spoken with royal fury. Breathe deeply. Let the tension dissolve into the mist of the past, because this war is about to begin, and you will bear witness. Morning light slowly spreads across the plain of Marathon. Dew covers the grass like a cloak of liquid silver, and the first steps of the Greek soldiers leave soft imprints on the damp soil. They are silent. Before them, on the other side of the field, stands the largest army any of them have ever seen. The Persian ranks stretch like an endless carpet, their round shields gleaming under the sun, and their spears rising like trees planted on the horizon. In the center, The royal standard flutters gently in the breeze, symbol of the will of Darius, King of Kings. It was September 490 before Christ. The Battle of Marathon was not just a fight for land, it was a fight for meaning. The Persians had come to punish, to teach that no act of defiance against the empire would go unpunished. The Athenians were there to defend their land, their honor, and above all, their freedom. And they were alone. Sparta had promised help, but would not arrive in time. The Greeks would have to face the enemy with what they had: courage, strategy, and the conviction that dying on your feet was better than living on your knees. The Athenian commander, Miltiades, knew he was facing a numerically superior force. It is said the Persians numbered over 20,000, the Greeks just over 10,000. But he also knew the Persian soldiers were trained to attack, not to resist, and that they were far from home, tired, overconfident. So Miltiades ordered something bold, a direct charge. When the sun reached its place in the sky, the Greek hoplites ran. They ran with shields firm, spears pointed, helmets fitted like extensions of the body. They ran nearly 2 kilometers, an immense distance for men armed head to toe. They ran because they knew the distance between doubt and courage is movement. They ran for freedom. The impact was devastating. The Greek flanks enveloped the Persian sides, forcing them to fall back to the center, while the central Greek line pulled slightly inward, then closed like a trap. It was a snare, and it worked. The Persians, caught off guard, could not reorganize their ranks. They were pushed toward the sea. Many tried to escape by ship, but over 6,000 died on that field. On the Greek side, fewer than 200. It was a brilliant victory, but also a warning. The Persians still had many ships, and Athens, unguarded, feared a direct attack. So, according to legend, a Greek soldier, Phidippides, was sent from Marathon to Athens, nearly 40 kilometers, to deliver the news of victory and warn of a possible assault. He ran without stopping, crossing trails, climbing hills, dodging stones, his body on fire and his feet bleeding. When he finally arrived, he exclaimed, "We have won!" and died. That run became immortal, not only for its physical endurance, but for the symbol it carries, one man's ultimate effort to preserve peace. Today's modern marathon honors that feat, but few know it was born in blood and dust, to the sound of spears and under the gaze of silent gods. After the victory, the Athenians marched home at full speed. When the Persian ships appeared on the coast, they found the city's walls manned and ready. Darius had been defeated. The first strike by the most powerful empire on earth had been repelled by a small city-state with few men, but great soul. The war, however, was far from over. It was only just beginning. The wounded pride of the empire would not accept defeat. And in the palace of Susa, among golden columns and hanging gardens, Darius made plans. But time gave him no chance. His death halted the next offensive. It would fall to his son, Xerxes, to carry the banner of vengeance. And he would do so with fury 1,000 times greater. But that vengeance is still on the way. For now the plain of Marathon rests. The blood dries slowly under the afternoon sun. The helmets have been gathered. The funeral pyres begin to burn, releasing into the air a scent of sacrifice and victory. And the living in silence look to the sea, knowing it will soon bring more ships. Now you too may rest. Let the sound of Greek victory cradle your dreams. Imagine the stacked shields, the murmurs of warriors around the fires, and the silence of the Greek night wrapping the plain. Sleep comes slowly, like a march, and you follow it. 10 years, 10 winters, 10 harvests, 10 summers in which the sea remained seemingly calm, and the Greek cities, though watchful, returned to their routines. But all calm before the storm is just illusion. And Greece, during that decade, lived in the shadow of an unforgotten promise. For in the heart of the East, the heir to the Persian throne did not sleep. Xerxes I, the new king of kings, son of Darius, still heard the whisper of Athens' name every night, just as his father had commanded before dying. Vengeance was not a wish. It was destiny. Xerxes was not just a powerful king. He was the living embodiment of an empire. His decisions echoed across 3 continents. His builders shaped palaces from white marble and golden columns, while his scribes recorded laws that governed more than 40 different peoples. Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Scythians, Armenians, Ethiopians, Indians, all beneath a single crown. an empire so vast that under it the sun never set, and for such an empire, vengeance would have to match its scale. In 480 before Christ, Xerxes decided the time had come. He would not send a mere punitive force, as his father had. He would march with the largest army the world had ever seen. Herodotus, the Greek historian, may have exaggerated in claiming over 2 million men, but the exaggeration hides a deeper truth. The army was colossal. People came from all corners, with different armor, diverse tongues, exotic weapons, war chariots, mounted cavalry, archers, spearmen, even beasts and engineers. It was more than an army. It was the world on the move. To cross from Asia into Europe, Xerxes ordered something unprecedented, a bridge over the sea. The Hellespont Strait, now known as the Dardanelles, was wide, deep, and dangerous. Still, the king ordered ships to be tied side by side, hundreds of them, creating a floating bridge covered with wooden planks and protected by barriers. When a storm destroyed the first bridge, Xerxes became enraged. He had the waters whipped, 300 lashes, and chains thrown into the waves as if punishing a rebellious servant. Then he ordered a new bridge, and it was built. Meanwhile, the land also bowed to his will. Trees were cut to open roads for the troops. Cities were forced to offer water and earth, symbols of submission. And those who refused, like Sparta and Athens, knew the confrontation was inevitable. When Xerxes reached Thrace and Macedonia, he was welcomed like a god. But his journey had only just begun. Greece, mountainous, fragmented, proud, would not bow easily. In Sparta, the ephors gathered in silence. Athens consulted the oracles. In Delphi, the priestess of Apollo delivered a cryptic prophecy. Either the city shall fall or its king will perish. No one knew what it meant. But Leonidas, the Spartan king, understood. He knew he couldn't stop a sea of soldiers in open ground. But there was a place where numbers didn't matter. A narrow pass between mountain and sea. A place where few could stand against many. That place was called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. A strange name, born from the sulfuric hot springs that bubbled there, steaming and hissing, as if the earth itself breathed in that place. And it was there that Sparta chose to resist. Leonidas, with his black beard and cold gaze, gathered 300 warriors. The best, the ones with children. For only those who had already passed on their lineage could be sent to certain death. They departed in silence with round shields, long spears, and crimson cloaks. With them came allies from other cities, totaling about 7,000 men on the first day. But it was the 300 who carried the weight of the symbol on their shoulders. Meanwhile, Xerxes advanced. His army darkened valleys, drank rivers dry, frightened forests. Each day, they drew closer to Thermopylae. And there, at the gates between the civilized world and imperial domain, two opposing ideals would clash. The freedom of the polis against the order of empire, the courage of the few against the rule of the many, death against eternity. But for now, the road still winds through the land. Horses still graze along the rivers. The wheels still turn slowly. War is coming, but has not yet arrived, and you may continue to rest. Imagine the torches flickering under the stars, the distant bells of ox-drawn carts, the sound of footsteps on packed earth, and the voices of 1,000 languages crossing paths in the night. Let this great march pass through the edge of your mind, like a distant dream. Sleep arrives, like the storm forming beyond the horizon. Before war, there is always fear, but there are also choices. And it was in that space, between the thunder of Persian footsteps and the silence of the oracles, that Greece had to decide, kneel or fight. In a world where every city was almost a country, where rivalries lasted generations, where agreements were as fragile as pottery under the sun, unity seemed impossible. Athens and Sparta, Thebes and Corinth, Argos and Delos, each with its own pride, its own dialect, its own favored god. But the threat from the east made no distinctions. It was vast and unstoppable, and when the enemy is too big to ignore, even the proud learn to gather. Thus was born the Hellenic League, a military pact without precedent among 31 Greek cities. 31 pieces of land, separated by mountains and seas, now united by a thread of survival. For the first time, Athens and Sparta stood on the same side of the battlefield, the capital of philosophers and the city of warriors. Dialogue and shield, naval strategy and land strength. There was no time for old grudges. An army was coming that covered the ground and the sky. Sparta, with its unquestioned military leadership, was placed at the head of the land coalition. Leonidas, the warrior king, was named commander of the troops that would try to halt Xerxes' advance by land. Athens, in turn, offered what it did best: its ships. Themistocles, the Athenian strategist, foresaw that the sea would be as decisive as the land. So he organized the Hellenic navy to try to stop the Persian fleet in the narrow waters between the islands. But it wasn't just a matter of weapons. It was also a war of faith. The Greeks sought answers in the oracles. In Delphi, the voice of Apollo whispered riddles that inspired both fear and courage. The wooden wall will save Athens, the priest said. Some imagined barricades. Themistocles, wiser, understood. The wooden wall was the naval fleet. The fight was not in the city. It was in the sea. And it was about buying time. Time was all Leonidas needed. That's why he chose the Thermopylae Pass, a narrow point between mountain and sea where thousands of men could not advance at once. There, Xerxes' numerical advantage became useless. It was like forcing a mighty river through a needle's eye. And as it squeezed through, the Greeks would drive in their spears. The choice of the 300 was not random. Leonidas knew the mission was suicidal. Only men with living sons could accept it, so their bloodline would endure. They departed in silence, knowing they would not return. But they also departed with honor. At their side were soldiers from other cities: Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, a few from Plataea. But it was Sparta that bore the banner. Meanwhile, Xerxes prepared his theater. He had a golden throne built on a nearby hill at Thermopylae, from which he could witness the victory. The King of Kings did not consider defeat. How could he lose? He had gods, men, monsters, engineers, and time on his side, or so he believed. But time, in that moment, moved differently in the mountains. Each step of the Spartans was a cut through the fabric of eternity. Each polished shield reflected not just the sunlight, but the conviction that to die for the polis was the highest of destinies. They were not fighting only for Sparta. They fought for an idea that freedom is not measured in numbers, but in resistance. And so, with the wind blowing from the hills, with the scent of the sea mixing with the clatter of armor, the armies drew closer. Soon, the first war cry would echo among the stones. But that night, under the calm moon, there was only thick silence, like the silence before the first note of a symphony, or the first thunder of a storm. You may close your eyes now. Hear this ancient silence. Imagine the tents rising, the spears aligned, the horses grazing, the sound of oars cutting through gentle waters. The world breathes in suspense. The alliance is made, the battle is marked, but sleep may still come before war. Imagine a place where the world narrows, towering stone mountains enclosing a narrow road, with the restless sea on one side and jagged rocks on the other. It's like a corridor carved by ancient gods, and it is there, at Thermopylae, that the fate of Greece would be sealed. The name in Greek means hot gates, because of the sulphurous thermal springs that rise between the rocks, releasing warm vapor even on cold nights. A name that feels symbolic, a gate to something greater. The Spartans arrived first. They set up camp with surgical precision. Their tents had no luxury. They were made to shelter bodies that would soon be called to fall. Leonidas, the king, wore no gold, no crown. His leadership was by example. He slept among his men, ate the same hard bread, and during the day he walked the ranks with a sharp eye, correcting postures, sharpening words, because there time was short, and the enemy approached like a cloud of dust on the horizon. From the other side, Xerxes watched from his hill. His golden throne had been placed with a perfect view of the pass. He saw the Greeks as stubborn insects. He did not understand why they would not surrender. He sent envoys, offered forgiveness, riches, titles. Leonidas replied with few words: "Come and take them." A simple answer, like everything that came from Sparta, but one that would echo through the centuries. The first days were silent. The Persian army, hundreds of thousands strong, was preparing. Generals discussed strategies. Soldiers adjusted armor from dozens of nations, round shields from Lydia, spears from Media, Egyptian sabers, Scythian bows. It was a museum of war in motion. But none of those men were ready for what awaited them in that narrow passage. Then came the first attack. Xerxes sent his regular troops, expecting to sweep the Greeks away like leaves in the wind. But there, at Thermopylae, the wind was Greek. Spartan spears were long, their shields unbreakable. Their formation was the phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, shield over shield, spears thrusting like iron teeth. When one soldier tired, he was replaced by another behind. And so for hours the Persians advanced and were pushed back. On the second day, Xerxes sent his elite, the Park Immortals. 10,000 men trained never to fail. It was said that when one fell, another immediately took his place. But the 300 were also immortal, not in number, but in courage. Leonidas knew each by name. He knew their children, their wives, their stories. And the men fought not just for him, but for one another. Persian arrows darkened the sky. A Spartan is said to have replied, "Good, we will fight in the shade." That was the Spartan philosophy. Not to resist death, but to master it. The dead were collected and replaced. The living rotated. But slowly, exhaustion set in, and even the finest spears can break. On the third day, tragedy came in the form of betrayal. A Greek man, Ephialtes, knew a secret path through the mountains, a detour that would allow the Persians to attack from behind. In exchange for gold, he revealed the way. Xerxes sent troops at once, and in that dawn Leonidas knew they were surrounded. He could have retreated, could have fled with the other Greeks, but he chose to stay. He released the allies, remained with his 300, and with a few from Plataea and Thespiae who refused to leave, because they knew that sometimes the sacrifice of a few saves the future of many. The final attack was fierce. Arrows, spears, screams. The ground shook. Leonidas fell. His men around him fought to protect his body. When all was done, only silence remained. The Persians had won, but they had not conquered. Days later, upon visiting the battlefield, Xerxes asked if there was an epitaph, and found a simple stone engraved with verses that still echo through eternity. "Stranger, tell Sparta that here we lie, obedient to her laws." This is the story of the 300, but not the end of the war. Their sacrifice bought time, united Greece, and lit a fire that even the greatest army in the world could not extinguish. Now rest. Imagine the steam from the hot springs rising between the stones, the distant sound of the sea crashing on the rocks, the breeze passing through abandoned shields. Bravery sleeps, and you may sleep too. Imagine a narrow valley between jagged mountains and a restless sea, a sacred corridor where time seems to slow down. It was there at Thermopylae that Greece lived 3 days that would echo through the centuries. 3 days of glory and resistance, 3 days in which numbers bowed before courage, and the world learned that those who win are not always those who survive. On the first day, the sun rose slowly behind the rocks, the ground still wet from the night. The soldiers' breath turned into mist in the air, but there was no nervousness. There was order. There was silence. The 300 Spartans, surrounded by allies from other cities, took their positions with surgical precision. No gesture was wasted. Every shield fitted, every spear sharpened, every glance exchanged in silence. The narrow pass prevented the Persian army from using its full force, and there between sea and mountain, what mattered was not quantity, but preparation. Xerxes watched from his golden throne above. He expected the Greeks to flee at the first show of strength. After all, what man in his right mind would face tens of thousands? But the Greeks did not flee. They stood still, like rocks, like walls of flesh and steel. And when the first wave of Persian soldiers advanced, it met total resistance. The hoplites moved forward and back in perfect rhythm. The spears pierced light armor. The bronze-covered Spartan shields made enemy swords bounce away in vain. And with every Persian that fell, another was thrown into the front. But the Greeks held firm. On the second day, the Persians tried something different. Xerxes sent his immortals, his personal guard. Warriors trained from childhood, cloaked in black, armed with curved spears and poisoned arrows. But legend collapsed before Spartan technique. The immortals were defeated. Like men, the Hellenic phalanx did not break, did not yield. When the front line tired, the row behind advanced. Like gears in a perfect war machine, shields tight, spears slanted, faces expressionless. In the distance the soldiers sang, yes sang, because Spartans faced death with serenity. They knew the battle was more than physical, it was spiritual. They did not fight for personal glory. They fought for Sparta, for a city that taught from birth that living was a privilege, but dying well was a greater honor. The day ended with fields covered in bodies. Persian blood stained the earth like thick ink, and still, Leonidas did not smile. He knew the night would bring destiny, and it was on the night of the second day that Ephialtes, the traitor, appeared, a deformed and bitter Greek who knew a secret path through the mountains. In exchange for gold and promises, he revealed the passage. The Persians sent troops to flank the Greeks from behind. When the news reached Leonidas, he understood. The third day would be the last. At dawn on the third day, the sky was grayer. The sea struck harder. There was a strange stillness in the air. Leonidas gathered his men, released the allies, allowed them to return to their cities, but the 300 stayed, and with them a group of Thespians and Plataeans who refused to flee. They stayed because death did not scare them. They stayed because they knew that the sacrifice would save Greece. The final attack was fierce. The Persians came from front and rear. The numbers were overwhelming. The long Spartan spears, once mighty, were shattered. They fought with short swords, then with bare hands, then with teeth and stones. Leonidas fell. His men fought to protect his body until the very end, and when the battle was over, silence fell like a curtain of smoke. Bodies covered the entrance of the pass, but not a single Greek had retreated. Xerxes ordered Leonidas beheaded, his head placed on a stake. But the Persian victory tasted bitter, because the days the 300 bought with blood gave Greece time to unite, the navy time to organize, and resistance time to turn into fury. Their sacrifice was not the end. It was the beginning. And so now you may imagine the final breath of a warrior in silence, the whisper of spears falling on stone, the crackle of torches among the bodies, and an old phrase, carved in stone, "They died for us. Now it is time to rest. Let the sounds of battle drift away like waves. Let the memories of those 3 nights fade like smoke in the wind. Glory has passed, and sleep may come." In every war, there are heroes, but there are also shadows. Men who do not shine under the light of bravery, but hide in the silent corners of history. One such name, whispered with contempt for centuries, is Ephialtes, a name that in ancient Greek means nightmare, and which, by irony or fate, became exactly that for the 300 Spartans. It was the second day of battle. Thermopylae still held with disciplined fury. Xerxes' army crashed again and again against the human wall formed by the Spartans and their allies. No strategy worked. No elite force prevailed. The King of Kings was growing impatient, and it was at this moment of imperial frustration that Ephialtes appeared, a Greek man, but with a soul already sold for gold. According to Herodotus, Ephialtes was a local, likely born near Thessaly. He had a deformed body, hunched back, uneven arms, and was rejected by many. He carried not just old wounds, but a map, a secret knowledge, a trail through the mountains that bypassed the narrow pass. A path known only to locals, used by shepherds and hunters. A path that could be the key to defeating the Greeks. Ephialtes approached the Persian generals and offered the information. He said that for a few coins, he could guide the king's troops through the pines, climbing the steep slopes until they reached the rear of the Greek defenses. It was betrayal in its purest form, not a tactical mistake, not a lost battle, a choice, conscious, calculated, cold. Xerxes agreed. He sent an elite force of the immortals to follow Ephialtes by night. The ascent was difficult, the vegetation dense, the path treacherous, but they climbed with determination. The silence of the night was broken only by careful steps and armor brushing against damp leaves. While the Spartans slept for a few hours, trusting in the narrow terrain, the serpent was already coiling from behind. At dawn on the third day, Greek scouts saw the impossible. The Persians were behind them. They had been surrounded. There was no escape. Leonidas understood immediately what had happened, and more than that, he understood what it meant. It wasn't just a military maneuver. It was the destruction of a symbol, and that's why he chose sacrifice. Ephialtes vanished after the battle. His story was lost for a time until years later he was identified and killed by another Greek. Since then, his name has become synonymous with betrayal. For centuries, when Greeks wanted to describe the worst kind of enemy, the one that comes from within, the one who knows the land, the one who chooses gold over honor, they said, an Ephialtes, and that weight has never faded. But there is something else to consider. Ephialtes was human, like us all, not a monster. He was made of the same doubts, pains, and frailties as anyone, and perhaps by understanding this, we can remember that in war, villains are not born, they are made. By exclusion, by contempt, by the absence of belonging, a reflection that still echoes today in the quietest nights. Now, turn your gaze to the mountain. See the trail where the king's men passed. See the flickering torches swaying through the shrubs, and feel the weight of a single step that changed everything. One gesture, one choice, one name, Ephialtes. But now the sound of betrayal dissolves into the mist, and you may rest. Breathe deeply. Let the mountain air fill your imaginary lungs. Feel the chill of the Greek dawn. Hear the sea striking the rocks and forget. For a few minutes forget, because night protects even those who carry the pain of memory. Good night, time traveler. The story continues, but so does sleep. The third day dawned beneath a sky that looked unchanged, but the world had already shifted. Deep within Thermopylae, where the morning mist kissed the earth and the wind carried the salt of the sea, the 300 knew it would be their final sunrise. There would be no reinforcements, no rescue, no miracle. There would only be them, standing, facing the end as if it were the most natural duty in the world. Leonidas walked among his men like a father among sons, but there was no despair, no shouting, no pleading, only readiness. Shields were aligned, each bearing the crest of its lineage. Spears were worn, many already broken. Short swords had been hastily polished. The faces of each soldier were marked with dirt, blood, and resolve. They would not die for vanity. They would die for honor, for duty, and for time, the time needed for Greece to awaken. On the other side of the pass, the Persian army regrouped. Xerxes knew the trap had closed. The Greeks were now encircled from two fronts. The strategy had finally worked, but the cost had been high, and even now, before the final blow, there was hesitation. For those men, though surrounded, refused to fall back. The final assault began like a storm. Arrows first, thousands. Then infantry, then cavalry sweeping from the flanks. But the 300 held. The front lines fell. Spears gave way to swords, swords to daggers, daggers to stones. Even bare hands became weapons. There was no space for hesitation. Every inch of land was contested as if it were the last ground on earth. Leonidas fell among the first. Not backward, but forward. The king died standing, surrounded by his most loyal guards. When he fell, his men fought to protect his body. The dead king was more dangerous to Xerxes than 1,000 living soldiers, because a king who dies for freedom becomes legend. And legends, the empire could not conquer. Bodies piled high. The screams of Persians merged with the stoic silence of Greeks. And even when all was lost, when the final spears broke, when the shields fell upon the dead, when the last survivors bled in agony, there was still the sense of mission fulfilled. That resistance had not been in vain. It was symbolic, the sacrifice of the few that would ignite the revolt of the many. When the battle finally ceased, the Persians walked among the dead as if treading on embers. Xerxes ordered Leonidas to be beheaded, his head impaled on a stake, but the gesture was not erased. On the contrary, and it was immortalized. A king who chose to die with his men, who refused to retreat, who stood like a pillar amid the storm. Years later, a monument was raised on that site. Simple, no gold, no carved marble, just a stone bearing eternal words. Stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here obedient to their laws. And that was all they asked, to be remembered, that their death not be in vain, that freedom has a cost, but also a seed. Now imagine the quiet plain, the sun sinking slowly, torches being lit among the rocks, the smell of blood mingling with the salted wind, and the sound of the sea, always the sea, singing its ancient song. The battle has passed. The heroes have fallen. But the story remains. Close your eyes, feel the weight of a shield resting against your skin, hear the heartbeats slowing, one by one, and fall asleep, for even warriors must rest. And you, time traveler, have walked beside them, until now. Some battles are won with numbers, others are one with time. Thermopylae was the latter, because although the 300 had fallen, the world had changed. Their sacrifice didn't stop the Persian army with spears, but delayed it with meaning. And in that delay, as a crack opened in time, Greece had the chance to prepare. Resistance became a cry, the cry became a call, and the call became an answer. Their death was the beginning. The news of the battle spread faster than Xerxes' troops. Greek cities, which once wavered between fighting or surrendering, now whispered the names of Leonidas and his men like prayers. They were remembered not as fallen, but as examples. It was impossible not to be moved. A handful of men facing the greatest empire on earth for 3 entire days, against all odds, without running, without trembling. In Athens, Themistocles understood the weight of that gesture. It was the opening he needed to finish building the new fleet. The Athenians abandoned their homes, their temples, their statues. They fled to the islands. They emptied the city. But they didn't flee from war. They fled to fight better. The Oracle of Delphi had said that a wooden wall would save the city, and that wood was the hull of ships. Meanwhile, Xerxes continued his march. He conquered land, crossed Boeotia, burned villages, and plundered a deserted Athens. On the heights of the Acropolis, his men lit torches among the temples. It was the peak of the empire, but also the beginning of its fall, because the sacrifice of the 300 had changed the Greek mind. For the first time, they were truly united. In the city of Plataea to the south, the Greek army regrouped. In Salamis, Athenian triremes lined up between the islands. In Sparta, grief became fuel. The name of Leonidas was spoken with reverence, and young men cited him as an example in their training grounds. Greece had not been defeated. It had been awakened. Geographically, Thermopylae was merely a pass, but symbolically, it had become a landmark. There, the few had resisted the many, and more than that, a myth was born. A myth not made of exaggeration, but of memory. A myth that would give strength to those who came next. The Persians, on the other hand, marched more slowly. The empire was expanding, but also stretching thin. The supply lines grew longer. The soldiers began to feel the weight of distance, of resistance, of fatigue, and Xerxes, though still powerful, no longer advanced with the same confidence. Because an idea, a small ideas, began to spread among his generals. If 300 Greeks could do that, what would 3,000 do? Or 30,000? The echo of Thermopylae was louder than any war trumpet. It was a whisper crossing hills, a name etched into shields, a memory in every sharpened sword. It was the certainty that freedom could be defended, even if only briefly, and that brief moment was enough. Now imagine the pass in silence. No bodies, no spears, just the wind. A wind that carries stories. A wind that even 2,000 years later still brushes against the rocks. Listen to that wind. Let it pass through you. Let it cradle your sleep. The sacrifice was made. Hope was born. And the world would never be the same. The earth burned under Persian footsteps, but the sea still belonged to the Greeks, and it was at sea that Athens prepared its revenge. After the fall of Thermopylae and the occupation of Athens, the Persian Empire seemed invincible. Xerxes had marched through the mountains, set temples on fire and spread fear, but something escaped his control, the movement of the waters. And in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the coast, a silent trap awaited. Athens was empty. Its citizens had fled to the archipelago, following the strategy laid out by Themistocles, the naval commander who could see beyond spears. He knew that in open waters, the Persians had the upper hand with their massive fleet. But in the narrow strait, everything changed. The Greek triremes, light and agile, could maneuver better. Like fish among rocks, they could ambush the giants. It was September of 480 before Christ, the same year as Thermopylae. While Xerxes settled in conquered Athens, his fleet anchored off the coast of Salamis. Thousands of ships from all provinces of the empire, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cilicians, Lycians, each with its own flag, command, and style. The Persian fleet was as diverse as its land army, but diversity doesn't always mean unity. Sensing hesitation among his Greek allies, Themistocles did something bold. He sent a secret messenger to the Persians, a false deserter. He claimed the Greeks were panicked, disorganized, ready to flee. It was a trap, and the Persians took the bait. They advanced at dawn, sailing confidently into the strait. But there, between the narrow shores, the tide turned. The Greek triremes emerged from the mist like birds of prey, each with about 170 rowers, moving in deadly synchronicity. They came fast, with their bronze rams aimed like floating spears, and when they struck the Persian ships, they shattered their hulls like rotted wood. The strait prevented the enemy fleet from maneuvering. The larger ships tangled, collided, confusion spread, chaos took over. The sound of cracking vessels mixed with the cries of sailors and the thunder of oars slapping the waves. It was a slaughter. The Persians tried to retreat, but they were surrounded. The once calm waters now boiled with wreckage. Xerxes watched everything from afar, seated on a throne set atop a hill with a view of the sea, the same habit he had at Thermopylae. But this time, he saw no glory. He saw defeat. His generals hesitated. His commands were lost. His confidence crumbled with each sunken ship. By the end of the day, more than 200 Persian ships were destroyed. Greece had won at sea, and not just won, had humiliated the greatest empire on earth before the king's own eyes. Xerxes, fearing rebellion or a surprise attack on his long supply lines, decided to return to Persia. He left part of the army under Mardonius' command and retreated with the rest. It was the beginning of the end of the invasion. Salamis proved that strategy and courage could defeat numbers and gold. It proved that war is not always decided by the strongest, but by those who have the most to lose. Now, the sea is calm again. The waves gently strike the island's rocks. The oars have been pulled in. The triremes float in silence. The warriors sleep, arms crossed over their chests, eyes turned to the stars. And you can rest as well. Hear the sound of water. Picture the moonlight shining on the sails. Feel the gentle sway of the boat gliding through the memories of time, because this war is turning, and you're sailing with it. The sea had returned hope to Greece. Salamis was not just a naval victory, it was a rebirth. Pride, once suffocated by the Persian advance, now flowed through the veins of every free city. And even though Xerxes had returned to Persia, the war was not over. What had begun with fire, sweat, and sacrifice at Thermopylae, and triumphed upon the waves of Salamis, now needed to be resolved on land. It was time to face what remained, and crush the empire's dream of conquering Greece once and for all. The Persians had left behind a large force, commanded by Mardonius, an experienced, ambitious general with clear orders. Subdue the remaining Greeks, divide their alliances, and occupy the region permanently. Mardonius believed that without Xerxes, the resistance would falter, but he didn't account for the echo of Thermopylae's deaths, nor for the soaring morale after Salamis. The flame of Hellenic unity burned stronger than ever. In 479 before Christ, the Greek armies gathered again. It was a vast coalition: Spartans, Athenians, Corinthians, Megarians, Plataeans, and many more. Around 40,000 Greek soldiers marched to the plains of Plataea, a small town north of Attica, where the Persians had built a massive encampment. It was open terrain, unlike narrow passes or sheltered ports, and that meant the battle would be direct, with no hiding, no tricks, only war. For days the two armies watched each other. Each side waited for the other to strike first. Mardonius trusted his cavalry and the experience of his foreign troops. The Greeks trusted their discipline and the tactics of the phalanx, but there was something else invisible, pulsing beneath the feet of the Hellenic soldiers. The memory of the 300, the dry blood on Thermopylae's stones, the words etched into their spears. The battle began after days of rising tension. The Persian cavalry tried to break through the Greek lines, but it was repelled. Mardonius then launched direct assaults. For hours, the plains of Plataea became a storm of spears, cries, and dust. Greek armor gleamed under the sun. Persian arrows whistled overhead, but the Spartan phalanxes held their ground. The men advanced like a living wall, and when they reached the Persian center, the impact was fatal. Mardonius was killed in the battle, and with his fall, Persian morale collapsed. The army retreated. They fled. They were pursued. Many were slaughtered along the banks of the Asopus River. Others surrendered. In the Persian camp, the Greeks found treasures: gold, tapestries, exotic horses, oriental wines. But the real treasure was invisible: freedom regained. With the victory at Plataea, the Persian invasion came to an end. The greatest empire on earth had been defeated by an alliance of small cities, divided by dialects and customs, yet united in the belief that living in freedom was worth any sacrifice. Greece had been saved, but the war was not just fought with weapons. That same year, another Greek victory came at sea, the Battle of Mycale, where the last Persian fleet was destroyed off the coast of Asia Minor. It was the end of the nightmare. The Hellenic world could breathe, and in homes, temples, and public squares, a new era began to rise. An age of art, philosophy, science, and politics. The classical age of Greece would only be possible because one day at Thermopylae, men chose not to retreat. Now the field of Plataea lies silent. The grass has grown, the stones remain, the wind blows as it always has, but the story is imprinted in the ground. Every step you take there is like walking over memories. Close your eyes. Feel the empty plain, the warmth of the sun on your skin, the smell of wet earth. The war is over. Freedom has won, and sleep can come, calm, deep, and without fear. Some stories cross the centuries like torches lit in the dark. They illuminate, they warm, they inspire, but they also transform. Because over time, the line between fact and myth dissolves like mist at dawn. The story of the 300 Spartans is one of those tales. Real, documented, powerful, yet so symbolic that it ended up wearing many faces. And in one of those faces, it gained exaggerated muscles, slow-motion battles, and a brutally poetic aesthetic when it became cinema. In 2006, director Zack Snyder adapted Frank Miller's graphic novel and released the film 300, a stylized and epic version of the Battle of Thermopylae. The movie wasn't meant to be a history lesson, but rather a visual poem. It portrays Leonidas and his warriors as semi-divine titans covered in sweat and courage, facing monsters, sorcerers, and grotesque armies. But what, after all, is true, and what is invention? Let's begin with the essentials. The battle really happened. In 480 before Christ, between the Greeks, led by Sparta, and the Persian army of Xerxes. Leonidas did in fact lead 300 Spartans, who heroically resisted at the Thermopylae Pass for 3 days. It's also true that other Greeks stood with them, like the Thespians and Plataeans. Leonidas's refusal to surrender and his death alongside his men are historically attested and echoed through the ages. But in the film, Xerxes is portrayed as an androgynous, almost alien figure, adorned with piercings and a supernatural aura. In reality, Xerxes was a powerful but human monarch, ambitious, vain, and extremely well served by his generals and administrators. There were no monsters at his side, no giants with blades for arms. These are visual liberties used to represent the idea of a dehumanized empire, not historical fact. Another distortion lies in the Spartans' appearance. On screen they fight without armor, wearing only capes and swords, like barbaric warriors flaunting their bodies. In truth, Spartan hoplites wore full armor, large shields, long spears, heavy helmets. They were disciplined, and their phalanx formation was more important than any individual strength. Real war was less theatrical and far more tactical. The film also omits something crucial: the allies. By focusing solely on the Spartans, it erases the nearly 7,000 men who made up the Hellenic force during the first days of battle. The Thespians, for instance, also refused to retreat and died alongside the 300. But that didn't fit the film's streamlined narrative. Ephialtes, the traitor, also appears in the movie, but as a grotesque, deformed, almost mythical figure. In real history, he was just a shepherd, a common man who knew the local terrain and made a tragic choice. The film version is symbolic, but it reinforces stereotypes and distances us from human complexity. Still, the film is not a lie. It is a myth, a modern retelling of an ancient truth. And myths have their purpose. They capture the emotion of history, even when they distort the details. The bravery of the 300 remains, even among digital lightning and stylized monsters. Because what truly matters, the decision not to retreat, to die for an ideal, to remain free even when surrounded, that remains untouched. And perhaps, by watching the film, millions of people were introduced for the first time to the story you've heard in detail tonight. Perhaps they sought out books, documentaries, or simply felt a chill when Leonidas shouted his final command. And even if he didn't shout exactly that way, the message was received. Now imagine the two versions of Leonidas, the real one in full armor, with steady eyes and controlled breath, and the cinematic one bare-chested, wrapped in dust and thunder. Both are echoes of something greater. Both, in their own way, resist. And you can rest. Let the noise of the cinema fade. Return to the silent past, where history was written with the blood of real men. Let the sound of swords fade away. And sleep, because whether it was legend or truth, no longer matters. What matters is that the courage was real, and now you've witnessed it. Time has passed, empires have fallen, cities were buried in dust and moss, but the name of Sparta remains. And the 300? They were never forgotten, because there are stories the world refuses to erase. There are sacrifices that pierce the centuries with the same force as an arrow released at dawn, and there are legacies that, though born in blood, blossom in humanity's collective memory. The 300 Spartans are such a legacy. Leonidas and his men fell at Thermopylae, but their fall was not silence, it was a seed. Because in every generation, every century, every land where someone asks, "What is courage?" the answer comes like an echo. Here we lie obedient to their laws. That simple stone left among rocks and rising steam survived the erosion of time. Poets, generals, philosophers, presidents, even modern soldiers have repeated those words. The sacrifice not only inspired Greek resistance, it helped shape the very idea of resistance in the West. In Sparta, the memory of the 300 became sacred. Their names were remembered, their descendants honored, and their culture, rooted in honor, discipline, and duty, was passed down like an unbroken thread. Sparta wasn't just a city, it was a concept, a way of living, a way of dying. And even though the city faded over time, its spirit seeped into speeches, flags, shields, and even ideologies, because Sparta represented the final wall between submission and freedom, the last stand, the final line. During the Roman Empire, generals cited the 300 as an example of courage. In the Middle Ages, knights carried phrases inspired by Spartan phalanxes. In the French Revolution, Leonidas's bravery was a model in the fight against kings. In modern wars, soldiers used the term Thermopylaean to refer to an honorable death in combat. In every era, Sparta returned, not as a physical place, but as a mental ideal. Even in art, Sparta never died. Sculptures, plays, books, paintings, and films have all brought the 300 back to life. Some tellings are realistic, others mythical, but they all share the same core: a handful of men choosing to face the impossible for what they believed was right. Yet there is something more subtle, and perhaps more beautiful. The fact that this legacy is not just about war, it is also about choice. The choice not to retreat, the choice to bear the weight of sacrifice, the understanding that death is not the end when you die for something greater. And that is what makes the 300 immortal, not because they didn't die, but because they died in the only way that cannot be erased. Today, when we walk through Thermopylae, there is little to see. A modern monument, some plaques, trees that weren't there before. But when the wind blows between the stones and the sound of the sea fills the silence, something whispers back. It's not a voice, not a sound. It's a presence, the presence of those who remained, who chose to fall rather than flee, who understood that sometimes to resist is everything. Now, it's time to close your eyes, to let the sounds of ancient Greece dissolve into your thoughts like a soft mist. The war is over. The legend lives on, and you can sleep. Breathe. Let the dust settle, hear the footsteps fade. The sea still crashes against the stones of Thermopylae, but the shields have been laid down, the spears rest, and the heroes sleep at last.